All right, now to our studio guest, the Environment and Energy Minister, Josh Frydenberg. And while he joins us, here's Danny Price from Frontier Economics. On AM this week, he helped design the energy market rules.
We are heading towards a third world power system very rapidly, and it's very hard to arrest a decline in the quality of a power system. It takes a lot of very bad decisions to get to this point, and it takes some good decisions to get us out of it. But given the way that the politics are panning out right now in Parliament, doesn't look as if we've got any movement towards an improvement. In fact, it's a substantial deterioration in the way that the government is managing. It's politicised this debate more than it really needed to or ought to have. Minister, welcome.
Nice to be with you, Barry.
You're being accused here of politicising a serious issue. Peter Credlin last weekend, former Chief of Staff to Tony Abbott, said of the carbon tax, which he said wasn't a carbon tax, Tony Abbott made it about the hip pocket and not about the environment, and that sunk Julia Gillard. Isn't that what you're doing all over again?
Not at all. See, Barry, politics is a battle of ideas, and when we see a bad idea, we'll call it out. And just 18 months ago, we had a deal with the Labor Party and legislated through the Parliament a 23.5% renewable energy target. Bill Shorten then fell under the spell of the deep green left wing of his party and produced a 50% renewable energy target. And now the government is prosecuting the case against that target because we believe not only will it lead to higher electricity prices and hurt the hip pocket and cost jobs, but it will also destabilise the system like we've seen in South Australia.
But Malcolm Turnbull's gone the other way. What spell has he fell under?
Well, Malcolm Turnbull understands the energy economics debate, and he has now focused very rightly on energy security, energy affordability, while accepting that we're moving to a lower emissions future.
Yeah, in other words, the hip pocket. You're talking about the hip pocket, power prices, rather than the big issue of climate change and emissions reductions.
Well, the big issue right now in Australia is how do we stabilise the system? You see, South Australia, which has more than 40% of its power coming from wind and solar, the highest on a per capita basis anywhere in the world.
And all but one of those wind farms in South Australia were introduced under Malcolm Turnbull's scheme.
But the South Australian Labor government allowed their state to go ahead with a high uptake of wind and solar without planning for the risks that pose to the stability of the system. You see, we're in a new world. Effectively, the electricity market has done what the communication system did when it went from a landline to a mobile. It's the biggest change in 100 years, and the system can't cope right now with the technology that is available to integrate a high uptake of intermittent sources of power when the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining, into a stable electricity system.
There is a crisis, and I'm sure industry's telling you that.
Absolutely, and we're working with industry. I mean, just on Friday, I met with BlueScope Steel, the largest manufacturer in Australia, Barry, 7,000 workers here. And they said to me that the issue of energy security and affordability was a matter of survival for their company. So this goes to the heart of jobs.
Well, survival, so if it doesn't improve, they're out of here.
Well, what they're saying is that electricity prices have been going up, and we've seen in South Australia the high uptake of renewables destabilising the system. They need access to reliable power, and that's why they're talking to the government.
Right, now you're the government, so what are you going to do about it? What's the remedy?
Well, Barry, our policies are focused in three key areas. The first is how do we keep baseload power in the system? That's why we're talking about cleaner coal and not allowing large coal-fired power stations to close into the future if we can avoid it. We need more gas into the system. Second, the Prime Minister has taken the lead on energy storage. He's recognised that we're very much underdone when it comes to pumped hydro and other forms of storage. So our Clean Energy Finance Corporation and ARENA have invested more than $150 million in various projects. And then the third part of our strategy is to get the states on board, because they're absolutely critical here. And their high renewable energy targets have really manipulated the system. And I'm very pleased that the coalition oppositions in South Australia, in Victoria and Queensland have said when they get to government, they won't be putting in place these high state-based targets. And dare I say it, the Labor opposition in Western Australia has also made that point.
We'll get back to the coal-fired power stations as you talked about, but going back again to Danny Price on AM, he said the federal government has no policy to achieve the Paris emissions pledge. Now, you're critical of the states, but they've stepped into this policy vacuum.
Well, can I just correct Danny Price on that regard? Because we beat our first Kyoto target by 78 million tonnes. The most recent numbers show that we'll beat our 2020 target by 220 million tonnes. And we've actually halved the gap to meet our 2030
and you know,
target.
you've done that virtually by doing nothing, because the states' targets, the ones that you say are too high, They're the ones that get you there.
That's actually not right, Barry. The Emissions Reduction Fund has been very successful in reducing our emissions. The Renewable Energy Target, in which we've seen an increase in renewables, but at a considered and a consistent rate, has actually helped do that as well.
But there's an element of that, though, isn't it, that you're criticising the states, and yet at the same time, they've helped you reach those targets.
No, but the state targets are completely unrealistic, and they will force out of the system the baseload power that we need. You see, when you have wind and solar, they don't have the characteristics that you get from baseload power, which can be produced 24/7. And that's the key. And that's why Alan Finkel, who's conducting for the COAG Energy Council a energy security review, has found that the system does need to be stabilised.
Do you think he'll be recommending new coal-fired power stations?
Well, I can quote him directly, and he says that low emissions coal with CCS, carbon capture and storage, is a very effective and very legitimate technology. That's Alan Finkel's words. I mean, even
new power stations?
Well, this is what we're looking at seriously. I mean, Wayne Swan, when he was still in office in 2013, actually commissioned a study for a new coal-fired power station for Queensland. Penny Wong, who was Climate Change Minister, said, quote, "It's in all our interests to find a low emissions technology for coal." The Labor Party has to face up to their previous
now
words and
saying, though,
actions.
that it's not economically viable, and that as renewables get even cheaper, as they will, and technology improves, then even less so.
But that's why Malcolm Turnbull has said it's all of the above. We've got to be technology neutral.
But you can't talk your way around this. If it's not economically viable, why should it even be a part of it?
Well, actually, the CO2 Cooperative Research Centre in Melbourne has done an economic study of the various options and found that clean coal is cost effective with both wind as well as gas.
But we're talking about new coal-fired power stations, and when that's an economically viable thing to do, industry's saying that to recover their costs, power would have to be increased. The price of power would have to be increased.
Well, the key here is about stabilising the system, and we don't have the storage technology today to ensure that intermittent wind and solar can be up to 50% of the market. So we actually need that coal and we need that gas. Now, if you look at other countries in the world, Barry, Japan, Germany, I mean, they have a 30% uptake of renewables, but they've got a new coal-fired power station, one of these Healy plants, coming into operation next year. In the United States, in Canada, they've just refitted their existing coal-fired power stations with carbon capture and storage. We're the biggest exporter of coal in the world. It's in our interest to see if this technology can be viable at home.
You talk about the Clean Energy Finance Corporation helping to pay for this if it happens, but that's designed to fund renewable energy projects.
Well, it's called the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. It's not called the Renewable Energy Corporation. Now, in the Act, it explicitly rejects carbon capture and storage and nuclear power. In the board guidelines, it actually confines investments to ones which reduce emissions by more than 50% on what the average is across the national electricity market.
Yeah.
So right now, a Healy plant, one of these high efficiency, low emission power plants, could not be funded under the Clean Energy Finance Corporation.
Because the 50% reduction is unreasonable, do you think?
Well,
is that what you're saying?
Well, the issue is if you can lower emissions and stabilise the system with base load power, that's a pretty good outcome for Australian households.
Would you like to see that mandated figure of 50% less than existing power stations, would you like to see that relaxed?
Well, the government's just looking at all its options because we...
And that's one of them?
Well, that is certainly one of the options that we're looking at because we recognise that we have an obligation, after what we've seen in South Australia, to ensure that this does not happen across the country. Unfortunately, Bill Shorten doesn't get it. He doesn't know if his policy is an aspiration, an ambition, a target, a goal. And Mark Butler, his climate change spokesman, is not taking the issue seriously enough because
they
it causes
couldn't
a
cost
hiccup.
it, but can you put a figure on, say, a 23% target by 2020? Can you put a budget figure on that?
Well, we've said it's going to cost around $10 billion in terms of the investment that would be required. That's a BI.
That's investment required, but what's the cost to the budget?
Well, in terms of the cost to households, it's $63
to the budget.
To the average household. Well, it doesn't cost the budget because it actually costs households.
So
that's the point about it. So it actually costs $63 for an average household, according to the Australian Energy Market Commission. This will require around $10 billion of investment or a cost, whatever you want to call it. But Labor's policy, repeated by Tanya Plibersek, Mark Butler, Nick Champion, Anne Ali, have all said $48 billion. Unfortunately, those words couldn't come out of Chris Bowen and Bill Shorten's mouth.
Now, you keep saying that that coal is the cheapest form of power, but Bloomberg said it's the most expensive, and that's because you ignore the costs around climate change.
Well, coal is just one part of the jigsaw. As the Prime Minister has made very...
It is the most expensive form, is it not?
Well, actually, right now, it's a cheaper form of energy generation in Australia than if you have wind or solar.
But that's because
gas.
you ignore the costs around dealing with carbon dioxide.
And that's why we say carbon capture and storage is absolutely critical. But if you look at the cost of renewables, they are coming down significantly, as the Prime Minister's made clear. In the last 7 years, solar PV has come down around 80% and wind generation has come down around 50%. Those prices will come down going forward. But you've got to understand what the real challenge for us now is. How do we integrate this higher uptake of wind and solar into a system which hasn't been necessarily built for that or had that situation in the past?
Well, just finally, though, what you're in government. So while you're in government, do you take full responsibility for the price of power?
Well, the prices of power went up more than 100% under the Labor Party. We haven't seen those levels of increases under us, but what we do take responsibility for is to working with the states to get a more stable, affordable electricity system as we transition to a lower emissions future. It's a wicked problem, trying to deal with all those three things at once, but we're determined to see it through.
Thanks for your time this morning.
Good to be with you, Barry.